Welcome to this Sunday in Advent. It's Advent 1, although Epiphany. I'm muddling myself up because actually this is the Sunday when we take up once again that Advent story that we began to tell at the beginning of December. So in a sense, it is a continuation of that looking forward and that visioning and that hope of waiting for the one who was to come that we began back then. So although last week was Epiphany Sunday and this week is Epiphany 1, it takes up that Advent story. And over the last few weeks, we've taken a bit of a side trip from that main storyline and been focused instead on the story of the birth of Jesus with all the attendant glorious music and rituals that have grown up around that in the Western Church, all that glory and majesty around the birth story. Today, we leave that aside and we take up once again the main thread of the story of the one who was to come, the one who was to come and lead a fragmented community, an oppressed and persecuted people back together, the one who was to offer reassurance that those people were still the people of God, or they could be if they chose to be, if they remembered who they were, if they were recommitting to being part of God's vision for the earth so that all could flourish. Once upon a time, Epiphany was a major festival, a sort of culmination of that Advent waiting and preparation. It was much more important than the Christmas festival, with all the association that had with the Roman festival of Saturnalia and the feasting and merrymaking that were the hallmarks of that Saturnalia festival. The early gospel to be written, the Gospel of Mark, doesn't even have a nativity story in it. But when the Roman Emperor Constantine got involved in institutionalizing the Christian movement early in the 4th century, the date of both Christmas and Epiphany were agreed and set at either end of the 12 days that marked the transition period of one year to the next, that marked that new year, that turn from winter dark to the lengthening again of the hours of light. Because they weren't as precise as us, so they needed 12 days for that to happen. We can pretty much tell when it's going to happen. These days, Epiphany, as a significant festival in the liturgical season, has almost lost its significance in the Western Church. It's overshadowed by Christmas and the baby Jesus story that precedes it, and Lent and the crucifixion that follows. It's sort of sandwiched between birth and death stories. But for the early Eastern Church, the feast of Epiphany was magnificent. It was focused on Jesus' baptism and the manifestation of who Jesus was as the Son of God. In Matthew's telling of the story of Jesus' birth, it is the Magi from faraway places and their gifts, echoing the prophet Isaiah, and the baptism of Jesus that are important. The story identifies the baby with the one who is to come and lead the way into the promise of God. And as you will have heard, Matthew's telling highlights the meeting between Jesus and his cousin John in the River Jordan, where John baptizes Jesus, and we hear that God says, "Behold my son, in whom I am well pleased." Note that this Jesus was an adult and not a baby. So it seems to me, Epiphany is in continuity with Advent, with John the Baptist's call to prepare the way for the one who is to come, and in continuity with Isaiah's prophetic vision. Now, in Epiphany, we hear the story of how John baptizes the one whom they have been waiting for, Jesus. And following his baptism, Jesus' ministry proper gets underway with God's blessing. In this way of telling it, Christmas is a bit of a distraction, an interspersed winter festival, a bit of a nod, if you like, to Roman religious sensitivities. It is no wonder it was not significantly observed in much of the Protestant church. It was even banned in some places as unbiblical. Matthew, however, realigns our emphasis. He shifts us from Christmas with all the Victorian rituals and glorious music that have come to shape it back to the main story of establishing who Jesus is and a different way of being a people together. He backs up his assertions with blatant connections echoing Isaiah to prove that Jesus and the stories that have grown up around him by the end of the 1st century when he, Matthew, was writing, were truly in continuity with the Torah and Jewish history. He wanted the Jewish people to know who Jesus was. Matthew's context, like Isaiah's, was troubled. The temple had fallen, and the people of Israel were looking for hope and reassurance that God had not forgotten them. Matthew, in the story that was read last week, sets a star over Jesus at his birth, and in its light men from the east come bringing gifts of great value. But rather than succumbing to the power of King Herod and his threat to kill the boy baby, they defy him in an act of civil disobedience and leave by a different route, thus thwarting his plan. The Jewish people could not help but hear in this story those echoes of Isaiah Matthew was offering as validation. The light on the mountain, the nations from afar streaming toward it, bringing their wealth, the promise of God's favor, and of course the story of Moses raised in exile to avoid Pharaoh's slaughter of the male babies. The one they were waiting for had come. Matthew was convinced of this. Matthew narrates how Jesus' true identity was revealed at his baptism. Jesus, Son of God, servant of justice, in whom God is well pleased, whose ministry following his baptism begins in earnest with his purpose and intention clearly set out in the Sermon on the Mount, which we'll hear in a few weeks. In this sermon, we learn what it means to be part of God's people. In Isaiah, scholars tell us the servant is Israel, the whole nation, not a singular individual. The nation must do things differently, be actively involved in justice making. The whole people. So too for us. It is together we are a servant people, charged with doing things differently, charged with bringing light and justice. The prophet Isaiah before him prefigures the agenda Jesus sets out, according to Matthew, in that famous sermon. Isaiah tells how God will gather together all who have been lost and dispersed and promises justice with peace and righteousness in their relationships. There will be no more violence. Salvation, healing will be their purpose. Jesus' own ministry agenda and purpose follows this pattern. Jesus' identity and purpose is made manifest for all who have eyes to see and ears to hear, and things will be different. In both stories, Isaiah and Matthew, the impact is great on the community who hears and takes the story to heart. As a community of faith, that is us. We too are baptized to become the servant of God's justice, to hold and proclaim a different vision of what it means to be a people together, of what it means to live in this earth with compassion and care, kindness and gentleness. Both the reassurance of light in the darkness and the promise of justice and salvation are offered to us. And these promises define us as a community because they bring with them the expectation, the demand that we witness by the way we live our lives and shape our relationships, that we are part of the community committed to bringing God's vision into being, to being part of the community that serves God's justice agenda. In our world today, a different vision of how to live with each other sustainably is needed ever so much. Today, we are on the brink of disaster. A climate crisis burns up lands, produces droughts, with famines, mass migration, disease, and perhaps even a pending war. Animals die at a horrendous rate. It seems God's vision for the earth as set out in the stories of the Bible is very far away. But that alternate vision that is painted for us by Isaiah and in Jesus' sermon is needed now more than ever. That promise of life comes into being as we invite everyone into the way of peace with non-violence, into love, into right relations and holistic well-being. There is much work to do. We are not especially privileged as we go about this work, however, but we can be extraordinarily important because we witness to the unexpected. We witness to the turning inside out and upside down of what has become entrenched in our way of life, and in so doing has lost its God life. We need to be looking for all the entrenched aspects of our world that are dehumanizing and death-dealing, and seek another way, instead of simply retracing the path we've already taken and ending up eventually in the same place we are now, and further entrenching the greed and power that brought us here. I venture to say that you know as I do that there is much in our world that needs to be different. Greed and grasping for power seem to me to be at the heart of most of those things, from the climate crisis to workplace poverty, from violence toward women and children to the abuse of old people, from housing obesity to the increasing wealth gap, just to name some off the top of my head. But as I've noted many times before, it takes courage to do things differently. It takes huge courage to risk change. Stepping outside what has become entrenched as common sense is to risk ridicule and censure. For Jesus, it was death. But justice and righteousness for all will come by a different route. We can see the different way if we will but look. Those who show that way are amongst us. We, you and me, just have to find the courage to recognize the way that they point toward. And we have to find the bravery to step into it and to tell a different story from that one we are familiar with, that one centered on greed and power. And so in these weeks of Epiphany, in these weeks between what was and what will be, these weeks of that Epiphany season, these are weeks in which we might well wonder what the year will bring once it gets underway. And wonder, I hope, what we will do and say to ensure that it is a year that supports life on the planet, life of planet Earth, life for people, and for all who inhabit the earth with us, all creatures. Because this is who we are, this is who we're called to be, this is what we're charged to do. Bring life, love each other, care for the earth, be hopeful, and know that we can do it because the light of life shines within us.